Let's Talk Lungs with Trent and Lori from Lung Saskatchewan. Dedicated to connecting you with lung health experts and key opinion leaders who will share current, evidence-based lung health information to inspire you and those you care for to take your best breath. This podcast is recorded on Treaty 6 territory, the ancestral and traditional territory of the Cree, Dene, Blackfoot, Saulteaux, Nakota Sioux, as well as the territory of the Métis.
On this episode of Let's Talk Lungs, we're pleased to welcome back Dr. Kyle Brown. Kyle is Associate Director, Field Medical Advisor with Moderna Canada. He brings expertise in medical affairs and medical information with a background in infectious disease, vaccine development, molecular biology, and mRNA technology. He completed his B.Sc and Ph.D. in Medical Microbiology at the University of Manitoba and also completed post-doc research with VIDO at the University of Saskatchewan. Kyle joined us previously for a foundational conversation on mRNA technology, but this time we're picking up where we left that discussion off, looking ahead to what is changing, what's possible, and what the future of respiratory vaccines might hold.
This episode of Let's Talk Lungs is sponsored by Moderna Canada. Moderna's mission is to deliver on the promise of mRNA science to create a new generation of transformative medicines for patients. Thank you to Moderna Canada for sponsoring this episode and helping us bring timely conversations in lung health and respiratory innovation to our listeners. Kyle, welcome back. We are really glad to have you with us again today.
Thanks, Trent and Lori. It's a pleasure to be back here today to talk about mRNA a little bit more.
Well, the last time you joined us, you helped our listeners understand the fundamentals of mRNA technology and why it mattered. So this time, we want to assume that people have that primer and move the conversation forward. So let's start there by focusing on what has changed the most in mRNA spaces since we last spoke. It feels like mRNA technology is moving beyond just a proof of concept. What signals to you that that shift is happening?
100%. mRNA technology is no longer just the answer to a single problem, but rather we're flipping it on its head. And we're now raising the question of what problems exist in the healthcare space and how can we use this new tool to tackle them. And so the rapid development and use of mRNA vaccines during the pandemic was a remarkable achievement. And delivery of billions of doses worldwide generated a lot of data that has helped to further develop our understandings of the capability of the technology and where we can go next. And some of the few clear indicators that we're seeing is that there's been a significant increase in the number of researchers working in the mRNA space. Mm-hmm. The number of companies, including ourselves, have invested more in mRNA technology as the solution to different disease areas. And most importantly, we now have domestic manufacturing capability of mRNA vaccines in Canada that will really help to bolster future pandemic preparedness.
Now, our episode title is Engineering Immunity, the future of mRNA technology and respiratory vaccines. So that really suggests we're talking about a platform, not necessarily a single product. And now, before we dive into the specifics of the platform, let's start first with a broader question. What makes the development of respiratory vaccines so challenging?
Well, respiratory vaccine development can be challenging because many of the viruses that cause respiratory disease are forever evolving to evade our immune systems. But let's be clear, not all respiratory viruses are challenging. So some, like measles virus, as an example, is very genetically stable.
Right.
And so this means the virus that we've been hearing about causing the outbreaks recently is really the same virus that's been around for decades, or very similar to the same virus that's been around for decades. And 2 doses of the measles vaccine can actually be up to 99% protective. And so this means that the outbreaks that we're seeing are not caused by the virus evolving or changing, but rather just a decline in childhood vaccination rates, which thankfully we're starting to see a change now and seeing more vaccination happening. But conversely, respiratory viruses like influenza and SARS coronavirus 2, which causes COVID-19, these viruses mutate frequently, and not just from season to season, but also within the same season. And so this means that these vaccines need to be updated on an annual basis, and sometimes they're less effective if the strains that they're targeting change before the vaccines roll out in the fall.
Interesting. So what makes the mRNA platform then uniquely suited for respiratory vaccines?
So the use of an mRNA vaccine allows for adaptable development timelines depending on how quickly you need the vaccine developed and scalable manufacturing. And so you can select a target virus strain or variant and manufacture a vaccine for it as late as 2 months before vaccine deployment. And so this allows you to better match the viruses that you expect to see over the fall, rather than currently, where a lot of times you're making a decision much earlier in the year based on what you're seeing in other parts of the globe. And so the other important thing is you don't require much input or output material. So a relatively small batch of vaccine, at least compared to other conventional vaccines, can provide millions of vaccine doses. And because the components, going back to the platform aspect, that many of the components of the technology are shared between the vaccines. And so you don't require separate manufacturing facilities for each of the different vaccines.
So then where is mRNA improving today?
Yeah, in our last conversation together, we did a deep dive into the basics of mRNA, and I strongly encourage those of you that have not heard it before to go back and listen, and even those that have heard it before, maybe go back and give it another listen, because I'll skip over a lot of the more technical aspects today that we dove into, a little bit deeper in the last conversation. But for starters, remember that there isn't just one way to encode an mRNA sequence. And so finding the optimal sequence can help to increase the effectiveness of the vaccine without significantly changing the rate of the adverse side effects. And it's not always a slam dunk. Some recent clinical trials, including from Moderna, have had to go back to the drawing board after, a first attempt at developing a vaccine. And in the case of our candidate influenza vaccine, the second formulation actually significantly improved the results compared to the first iteration. But this also highlights some of the advantages of the next generation mRNA vaccines that are being developed, because they can actually tailor smaller components of the virus protein. So rather than targeting the entire protein, you can target more specific components, which can help increase the breadth and or the strength of the immune response. And these shorter mRNA sequences can actually have some other potential side benefits, I should say, such as enhanced stability, lower doses, and more friendly storage conditions overall.
So then, Kyle, can you talk to us about durability, or how long these vaccines provide protection?
That's a really important point, and so thank you for highlighting it. It's essential to note that durability is a concern with every vaccine, so not just with mRNA. And you want to ensure that once an individual is vaccinated, that they're protected for as long as possible. And there are many components that influence that, including what parts of the immune system are being triggered, things like neutralizing antibodies you may hear about, or memory B cells or T cells. And so how these different pathways are being stimulated and how they interact together, along with what we've already talked about of how frequently these viruses change, all determine how long a vaccine will provide protection for. And so therefore, overall durability is going to be determined by a number of factors beyond simply just what technology is being used for the vaccine. And so a lot of work is being done to ensure that the durability of the vaccine is for as long as possible. But it's always a balance between how often you need to get another dose versus how low you let the effectiveness of the current vaccine get over time before you feel that you need another dose to boost that effectiveness back up to what you saw with the initial vaccine dose.
One thing that stood out in preparing for today is that the mRNA story is no longer only about COVID. We are now seeing activity across influenza, RSV, and combination respiratory vaccines. So then tell us, Kyle, how important is that shift in the public conversation?
As we've discussed before, the mRNA vaccines were relatively unknown before the pandemic. And so when two effective vaccines were developed at about the same time and using this technology and then were released into the public, the use of mRNA quickly sprung into the limelight. And with that, many questions were raised. And I'm sure these were many questions you yourselves had as well. They were the right questions, like how does it work? What does it contain? How safe is it? How many doses do I need? But with that, there was a lot of misinformation and some disinformation that was being shared, and as well as maybe a valid fear of the unknown that drove a lot of vaccine hesitancy over time. But just as a side note, think how crazy is it to think of how aware the general public is of the technology behind their vaccine that they're receiving, and even the brand for that part. How many people know what technology was behind the other vaccines that they've received? If somebody asked, what technology or what kind of flu shot you got last year, most people wouldn't be able to say. And so things have really changed, and it's, the information that's being shared on the internet and through other forums from healthcare providers is really meaning that there's a lot more information available than there ever has been before. But remember that all conventional vaccines that we use today were all new at one point. And so a lot of the information over time was learned about how they work. And as more and more vaccines were developed using the technology, the public acceptance grew. And so I think we're finally in a transition phase where we're, with the broader public at least, where we're starting to see that with mRNA vaccines.
So for listeners, when we say vaccine pipeline, what are we referring to, and where is the real momentum right now?
So practically, when we say vaccine pipeline, we're talking about vaccines of the future. Those that, for example, are in preclinical development, so maybe in animal models, those that are currently being evaluated in human clinical trials, or those that are completed clinical trials, but maybe they're with Health Canada for review or for approval of the vaccine. And now most of the exciting momentum around mRNA, again, comes back to what we talk about it being a platform technology. But what do I mean by this? Well, historically, when you want to create a new vaccine, you need to go all the way back to the beginning of that pipeline to create something completely new, something completely different. And that could take upwards of 10 to 15 years. And with mRNA, the development of vaccines has now become an iterative process. And so this means that the existing vaccine platform can have small changes made to it to be adapted for new targets or maybe different patient populations. And now this process can happen much more quickly, which brings new vaccines for patients while still maintaining that high safety standard that we expect. And that's what's really starting to change the game.
Thank you, Kyle. We are going to take a short break and get right back to our conversation with Dr. Kyle Brown.
Lung Saskatchewan has long been associated with leadership in health professional continuing education. Once known as a conference, Inspired Breathing now represents Lung Saskatchewan's renewed commitment to providing continuing education events for healthcare professionals that are responsive, innovative, and centered around partnership. Inspired Breathing inspires innovation, alignment, and partnership in lung health professional education. Lead in transforming care. Find out more at lungsask.ca.
Well, welcome back, listeners. We're speaking with Dr. Kyle Brown about the future of mRNA technology and respiratory vaccines. Kyle, we've also been hearing more about the possibility of combination vaccines. Now, on paper, sounds pretty appealing. Are combination vaccines just about convenience or something bigger?
Convenience is definitely a primary motivator for us, for patients. It means fewer needles and less time making multiple vaccine appointments. So the vaccines you need aren't all available at the same place in the same time. For healthcare providers, it means less time spent per patient and easier documentation afterwards, which in a time crunch situation, we know this is always challenging for healthcare providers. But with combination vaccines, so for example, one that might contain influenza and COVID-19 together, vulnerable patients can be protected more effectively, especially if the vaccine components are tailored specifically for them. And therefore, the healthcare provider doesn't have to mix and match different vaccines to try and receive similar results. And they might also be worried about how those vaccines interact with one another. And so we already know in a combination vaccine how these components react when they're delivered together. And the other big thing is that vaccine recommendations from groups like NACI typically have a big overlap of vulnerable patient populations. And so combination products can help to increase the overall vaccination coverage rates across different vaccines, which for public health means fewer hospitalizations and less burdening of the healthcare system. And so that's all why this really matters in practice.
Important point. So the review article we looked at also points to real challenges: stability, delivery efficiency, raw material cost, and manufacturing complexity. So can you help listeners to better understand these key constraints?
Of course, yeah. I think that this really goes back to this being a newer technology when compared to the other vaccines. And so Going back to, again, when COVID-19 vaccines were first created, the goal was to have a safe and effective vaccine first and foremost. And little consideration was being given at the time for long-term stability, for material costs, for delivery efficiency. And now that we're in a post-pandemic world, but COVID-19 continues to circulate on an annual basis, the focus has now shifted into improvements within those areas. So, for example, we want vaccines that have longer shelf lives and we have less wastage, maybe with use of prefilled syringe versus multi-dose vials. And these are all things that have impact on patient workflows and on vaccine uptake overall. And then, to address the last part of what you said, there's still a lot of unknowns when it comes to cross-border shipping and trade and supply. And so there's, of course, a greater interest in strengthening our manufacturing and supply chain within Canada. And Canada has amazing opportunity to become a leader in the mRNA space.
Well, Kyle, then tell us what still needs to be solved.
So there's lots that can always be improved, with new technologies. And so work is being done on alternative vaccination routes, such as inhalable vaccines versus just injectable, maybe better cell targeting, once the vaccine is received. And this more targeted administration could reduce the amount of vaccine that needs to be provided, means more doses are available. It also could mean fewer side effects from receiving the dose. We're also learning, again, how the mRNA vaccines trigger the immune response. And so by having a better understanding of that, changes can be made to drive one specific immune response rather than a one-size-fits-all approach for all vaccines for all patients. And then the other real barrier, and this is kind of on a tangent to that, but is that the world has really not caught up to the speed of mRNA. And so things like receiving new recommendations on vaccine use, decisions on how to implement these vaccines and who's going to cover the costs, these things all take time. And if you're developing new vaccines quickly, that can really delay, the time until you actually get these vaccines into patients' arms.
Okay, when people hear fast innovation, some still worry that speed could come at the expense of caution, of course. So how do you talk about the balance between urgency, evidence, safety, and trust?
Now, we know that whatever changes are made to speed up the timelines, that safety can absolutely not be compromised. Trust takes time to build, and once it's broken, it takes a long time to repair. And unfortunately, there were a lot of communication mistakes during the pandemic as everyone had to move quickly and with limited information resources available to protect the public as best as they could. But it really does show the importance of how we frame information when we share it with patients and with the public. But one of the benefits of these rapid development timelines for COVID-19 vaccines was it actually highlighted many of the inefficiencies in the system. And so what that means is that when everyone works together, things can actually happen a lot more quickly. And so it's a removal of these inefficiencies rather than just speeding it up for the sake of speeding it up that can really help with this process. And so we're also, engaging stakeholders. So some of these decision makers around things like recommendations much more earlier in the development process now that we have that time that we didn't have during the pandemic. And that can also speed up the process too. And importantly, regulators like Health Canada have evolved as well and are now willing to look at information beyond just the clinical trials that are used for the approval. They're looking at things like post-approval trials and real-world evidence generation and surveillance and immunogenicity studies. And these can all help to better inform the decision-making and help to better balance that risk-benefit discussion with patients.
So let's bring this back then to lung health more directly. For people living with chronic lung disease, older adults, or those at increased risk of severe infection, what could advances in respiratory vaccines mean in practical terms?
So in practical terms, it really opens up the potential of vaccines that are being created that are better optimized, again, for the high-risk groups that you mentioned. Similar to what we already see with enhanced or high-dosed influenza vaccines. And so we may be able to move away from trying to figure out, again, just how a single vaccine can be made to fit everyone, but rather have vaccines or therapies that are custom tailored to specific vulnerable populations. Another recent advancement is the growing recognition that vaccines beyond just protecting against severe disease, against, that whatever disease they're targeted against, could actually also have a significant impact on preventing the worsening of chronic health conditions, including things like lung disease. And I'll use an example. So, when individuals that are vulnerable get a respiratory infection, the inflammation in their bodies can make their chronic conditions worse. So, for example, if we visualize it as a scale from 1 to 10, maybe their lung disease worsens from a 4 to a 5 on that scale. And when that infection finally clears, those individuals don't go back down to a 4. They just stay at a 5. Mm-hmm. And so then when they get another infection, then they proceed now to a 6 on the scale. And so importantly, being vaccinated means they're going to have less inflammation. They're going to clear the infection quicker. And that helps to break this progression, and it helps prevent this worsening of the chronic disease over time.
So could this eventually change then how we think about protection, moving from reactive seasonal strategies toward more tailored or broader prevention?
Of course, vaccines should be considered as part of a healthy lifestyle. And this should be included with conversations like things about eating healthy or exercising more frequently. These are all preventative steps, and they should be part of those conversations with the pharmacist or with the primary care doctor. And so it's also important to know that vulnerable patients frequently don't recognize themselves as such, and they strongly rely on recommendations from their trusted healthcare providers about which vaccines they should be getting. And so combine this with changing coverage programs and new vaccines being available that weren't before, really stresses the need for healthcare providers to be confident in their vaccine recommendations. Mm-hmm. And then finally, and this is, again, I can't stress how important this last component is, but we really need to ensure that vaccines continue to be made available to vulnerable patients. Adding barriers like cost, limiting locations where vaccines can be delivered, or restricting vaccine supply can all have detrimental effects for both patients as well as the overall provincial healthcare systems.
Mm-hmm. And is there anything especially important about mRNA technology when we think about protecting populations that may be disproportionately affected by respiratory infections?
There's a couple of points that I think we've talked about that can really address that. And it goes back to what we've spoken about already, that mRNA vaccines can better match circulating virus strains in advance of the fall vaccine season. And again, that's because of those shorter manufacturing timelines, that 2-month kind of time window before the vaccines are required. And additionally, in the case of things like influenza vaccines, the majority of those that are used in Canada right now are manufactured in eggs. And you may have heard, that you can get adaptations within the eggs as the vaccines are being created. And this also can make them less effective in protecting humans. And this really doesn't happen with mRNA. And so practically, this may be less of an impact on, say, a healthy individual that's receiving the vaccine, but it's greatly important for patients, with a greater risk of severe respiratory disease and hospitalization, because they need the best protection that they can get. And as an example, this year, there was a mismatch in the influenza vaccine. And so this means that while the vaccine was still somewhat protective against some of the other strains that were included within it, the third strain was really largely compromised. And so this significantly increased the burden of influenza this year, and we saw a large increase in hospitalizations. And you may have heard of a lot of people around that maybe got flu this year for the first time, when they hadn't in a number of years. Mm-hmm. And so the use of mRNA could really allow us to avoid mismatches like this in the future.
Well, as someone working in this space, what feels most exciting to you right now? And not necessarily in a hype-driven way, but in a scientifically meaningful way.
Yeah, the thing that has always excited me the most is just the potential. And there have been so many barriers to the development of various vaccines in the past that researchers have been unable to find solutions for. And so by always putting this new tool into the hands of these experts can really drive innovation, and it can drive discovery. And one way Moderna is contributing to this is through a program we call mRNA Access. We've worked in collaboration with many global partners and academic institutes to give scientists and clinicians access to mRNA technology so that we can make these new discoveries together. I'm excited also about the potential of mRNA platform beyond just its use. As much as we're focused really on its use in respiratory viruses today, there's a lot of exciting data coming out about its use against viruses like norovirus or bacterial infections like Lyme disease, or its use in the oncology space or rare disease space. And so in the next 3 to 5 years, you can really expect the landscape to be very different in how mRNA vaccines and therapeutics are being utilized.
Okay, Kyle, as we get close to the end of our time, let's leave listeners with a forward-looking lens and a big question. Where can Canada lead in this next phase?
That's always really exciting to talk about. And I know in our last episode together, I did highlight a number of ways that Canada is already working on becoming a leader in mRNA technology. But it goes back to the fact that Canada has an amazing number of researchers and clinicians and academic institutes and industry partners that can all work together with public health to achieve many goals. And that includes things like expanding the number of clinical trials in the country and making sure that those clinical trials are representative of the diverse makeup of the population that we have in this country. We can develop mRNA centers of excellence where experts can be trained on these new technologies and subsequently help to further train the next generation of healthcare providers, because a lot of their education hasn't caught up to a lot of this new information. And then kind of conversely, it's also the knowledge translation efforts, right, to bring this information to the general public as well, because that's the way that we're going to combat vaccine hesitancy as well as misinformation. We need to build more manufacturing capability in the country. It's exciting. This past season, Moderna was able to produce our COVID-19 vaccine in Canada for Canadians for the first time, and the hope to have more vaccines being produced in country in the future. And then finally, and this is more of a recent development, is that we need to increase our surveillance systems in the country to better track which viruses are circulating. We need to track the burden of disease, especially in high-risk vulnerable patients. As we can really no longer rely on other countries around the world to do this work for us and then make decisions on it. We need to be more proactive in how we're getting this information.
So for those who still think of mRNA only through the lens of the pandemic, what would you want them to understand about the bigger and longer-term story now unfolding?
We're really living in the golden age of medicine, and we're hearing about new classes of drugs, new vaccines, new technology. These things all make diagnosis easier. This makes treatment easier, and it's using tools like mRNA that we've been talking about, but it also uses things like AI, of course, and gene editing and nanotechnologies and all other kinds of new things that are coming out all the time. And so we're rapidly gaining new ways to treat both acute as well as chronic diseases that have been around for decades. And these discoveries are far outpacing what the historical norms have been. Mm-hmm. And so the expertise that we're gaining with mRNA technology will allow us to innovate beyond what was even thought possible before. Goes back to it being a new tool for healthcare providers to more effectively treat and prevent disease in their patients, and allows us to come closer to that promise of what we call personalized medicine. Treatments that are designed for the uniqueness of the individual rather than trying to take one treatment and then blanket that to the entire population. And so the future, I believe, truly is mRNA, and the future is now.
Well said. Well, Kyle, thank you for joining us again for this episode. We certainly appreciate you helping us move the conversation beyond the basics and into what comes next. And it's clear that mRNA technology it's not standing still, and that respiratory vaccine innovation is entering an important new phase. So thank you again for sharing your insights with us and with our listeners on Let's Talk Lungs.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support LungSask's Let's Talk Lungs podcast, please share it with others. Post about it on social media. Like, subscribe, hit that notification bell for new episodes, and leave us a review. Follow LungSask on Instagram @LungSask and on X @LungSask. That's all for this episode. See you next time.
Produced at
Sound Lounge by T-Bone.